welcome to Liminal Light, a show that explores the languages of myth and star, earth, sky, tongue, and spirit through weekly astrological forecasts. I'm your host, Chris. Enjoy. The sun reaches its highest degree of exaltation at 19 degrees Aries, and here shines most radiant, other than in Leo. This is the sun of burgeoning spring, a sun vitalizing the land and penetrating it with light and warmth. Venus is in Taurus, emphasizing fecundity and fertility, and Mars and Saturn are still co-present in Capricorn, with aims of stabilization and monumental construction. Mars is in its exaltation in Capricorn, and is there co-present with Capricorn's ruler, Saturn. Mars rules Aries, where we find both the Sun and Mercury, benefiting by the Sun's exaltation, and Aries' ruler also in exaltation. Jupiter as well is in a Mars-ruled sign. This is certainly a time of doing and of action, but of a particular kind of action that stresses maneuvers rather than belligerent attacks. With an exalted sun aiming our focus on the individual and the impulsive fire of the individual spirit, the personal impetus, we reach highest exaltation, enacting pivotal strategic moves towards engaging and expressing our inner fires, to manifest our wills in the world, to establish or assure our own starfire. Sunrise on the 8th might culminate with us bearing crowns and striving to gather the courage to wear them. We might rise through rings of gold into personal consecration, or focus on a specific emblem that represents ourself and arrange to anoint it with the most solar ointment. This peace we might carry on us through the year, a point of courage, of strength, and of purity, of cleaning, of vitalizing, to support our heads and connect to them to our hearts, to radiate our best selves to those we meet, to retain alignment with our truth and the truth of our virtues, to be generous enough to ourselves to operate and act, to feed our own fire and not neglect or forget, and later find our flame has died to a flicker or merely a smoky smolder with only wet wood around. Today go light your pilots so that you might cook cleanly and continually all year. Scour and tarnish and rub away the resin, and find beneath the dull stone a particle of gold. Venus has advanced into Taurus's second decan today, focusing her attentions on even more refined tastes. She is attracted to luxury in Taurus, her domicile, and luxury is attracted to her. But where she is able to feel her way toward what she wants and wealth to acquire it already in the first face, the second decan she slides up even closer to the sustained source of fecundity itself, and closer to the central pole she enters an even more focused awareness of entitlement and indulgence. The bear that sat in the sunny patch all day gorging on berries now eats instead caviar and wears diamonds. Comfort food becomes fine cuisine. The best things in life are no longer necessarily free and are worn to feel the weight of their value. This is only a problem when we can't have them, when we can't afford the 5-star restaurant and are forced to eat at the diner. Venus in Taurus generally hands you gifts and takes you out to eat, so it will generally go in the way of Epicurean elation, but with the trine to Saturn only now separating, this might have its limits, at least as far as falling into certain time slots, and with her immediately applying to Mars, it might be that we can purchase the pleasure we desire as long as we can work it into the plan. Either way, it is very worth paying attention to the presence Venus passes out, as there could easily be other factors involved that keep us constrained to our workbench, and it might be these material merriments that maintain our machinations. On Monday, April 9th, briefly after reaching his traditional degree of exaltation, the sun moves into the third decan of Aries, where the fires of the heart pump and pound to perform passionately and ignite the spirits of others, stirring their embers, lighting things up, and catalyzing inspiration. Sometimes these performances are brief, as such passionate displays and spirited recitals require considerable energy, and fuel can be consumed rather quickly. Again, it might be wisest to take advantage of Saturn and Mars' strategic inclinations in Capricorn to achieve our visions when showing off, as well as Venus and Taurus' offerings of material generosity and abundant delicacies. Keep grazing on the greens and observe natural limits, as well as stores of supplies as you attempt to personally sustain star power. This might be more like a slow-tempoed and sultry dance, where seeming exhausted or out of breath detracts from the spell. So keep your cheeks naturally rosy and aglow with a combination of indulgence and careful steps, so as to keep grounded and not overexert. The easy pleasure of organic control could appear most radiant and spark chain reactions of kindled hearts. Between the fire found in our hearts and that within our heads, and the one which stabs into the ground from the most base bone of our bodies, a final first spinal spike that solidifies the channel of flame on a broader spectrum and filters to focus in our minds. Saturn guides the stylus with a skeleton hand along stone tracks, with Mars in charge of where the point is pushed and plunged through the wall like wax, spreading the cobblestones like flower petals to reveal the pistils. And there is another flame, thin and white, and it coagulates in the whole of the earth as a magmic force, akin to that found in the heart of the hive, where honey is held rather than blood, somewhere between the plasmic inferno of the sun and the lava kept in the center of the earthly sphere. We have these points and places as well, and it is in the style of dance we choose, the poise of posture and motion which align the elements so as to juggle them in the most excellent combination for the moment, to the subsonic rhythm, rather than drop them in fright or rush through their volley in dead operation. In this particular combination of planets, we might attempt a schema of functional management that is somehow also earthwise, decadent, sensual, and inspired. Just past midnight, the calendar tears into the territory of the 11th, and the sun squares Pluto. Something about our impassioned performance, the spiritual drive to act, and the individual volition vision for which we strive clashes with the unknown, approaches the void with friction, comes before unparalleled power and tension. Our path is not necessarily lit before us. We may be charging into darkened territory that our torch does little to penetrate. To pull off this performance, we must cross a stream of fear blindly, both an ordeal and a leap of faith. We must act without predictable results and do that which we had never before considered, or at least stuffed into the closet, hid inside the wall, sandwiched in the stacked stones, forgotten in the framing. Now we pull the old portal back out, and for the first time unfurl it and lay the black circle onto the floor, then leap below. It's not that this is a diversion from the safety of the strategy. It's just that success requires that we swim into the cave to reach the rest of the course. There's no alternate route. Luckily, Venus trines Mars around this time. Yes, we plunge into unknown territory, performing moves we never before attempted, in venues we never imagined existed. But it's probable that though scary and unpredictable, it feels really good and might even be quite a turn-on. The erotic power of the well-played pursuit of luxury, both ruthless and nuanced enough to avoid belligerent blows or vicious slashing, but instead sensual dominance games, wrestling for best placement, the most powerful position, for most complete grappling lock. As we pass into the black hole and find our way by other senses than sight, we encounter new sensations that are deeply satisfying. These resonate with our pursuits and come to harmonize with our critical as well as crisis responses. When we move a heavy chess piece to a new place on the board, we gain the opportunity to caress it and fondle it as it's passed. When we do this blindfolded, the contours of the piece become even more important to how we play. And when we play with a new and mysterious partner, the game becomes even more stimulating, even though we have no idea what to expect. By noon on Thursday, Venus sextiles Neptune, So the erotic luxury of these material power pursuits might easily lead us into a dreamlike fog of fantasy and illusion, which could have us feeling intuitive in a hands-on way, when our imaginations are so strong it feels we can reach out and touch them, and maybe we can. This occurs with Neptune on the fixed star Achenar, which can lend to a situation the solution of sweeping something away by crisis, as in a fire or a flood. This reminds us of the Sun square to Pluto and Venus's harmonization with Mars. There's an intensity lurking in all these aspects, despite the rhythmic pace and material pleasures. We might find that during our dance steps, we inadvertently stomp our problems away, even if that means kicking and crushing our frozen computer, which is now reduced to cracked plastic. Our computer is gone, but at least it's no longer frozen. Rather than a computer, we are more likely to lose some emotional issue, some old mood that swells up like the tides, but this time sloshes over the edge of the cup in the swaying and sachets, and then flows down the floor drain. This can seem like a crisis at the time, but it might be worth considering that we now have our hands full and can't put out every old fire. There's only so much water in the hose. Instead, it might be time to rotate our crops. On Saturday, April 14th, just before sunrise, slow-moving Jupiter in Scorpio finally perfects his sextile with much slower-moving Pluto in Capricorn. The aspect has been applying for over the course of the past couple weeks, and will continue to color things as it separates over the next few. We might want to look back to mid-January and consider what nature of our deep understandings we are coming into greater clarity. Then it might have highlighted growth of our internal labyrinths, the expansion of our shadow selves, and the enlarging territory of our soul's pools, the network of caves, which is the infrastructure of our souls becoming deeper, bigger, and more elaborate. We could have initiated ourselves into mysteries and pulled dark elements of ourselves out of chasms to submerge in alchemical filtration and purification processes. This round, as Jupiter is retrograde, is more likely to find us coming to find deep wisdom from this growth and alchemical change. We might understand a whole new system and source of power in light of what initiations have been begun in January. Here it might be important to feel the things are expanding by enlarging our coherence and knowledge of these dimensions of ourselves, rather than trying to build more parts or construct more chambers for our souls. For now, until Jupiter returns to direct motion in July, become bigger by knowing more about what is present and established, rather than mutating into a larger size or adding more complexity. This is a consideration of what exists beyond limits, but of those elements beyond limits you have recently crossed. Only a few hours later at 8 a.m., the moon conjoins Mercury, who has slowed down almost to a stop and is preparing to station. Over the week, Mercury has been steadily separating from the Sun, having been recently purified, and is collecting his thoughts. Upon waking up on Saturday morning, we might have geared to not only reflection deep into our souls and selves, but also into the minutiae of our thinking. As many of our logic systems here, having been recalibrated, get ready to reboot, tossing up definitions of what we feel like we can release in an exhale as we begin to come to a stop in our thinking in order to engage in new personal logic. 2 hours later, Mars conjoins Vega, a prominent star of Orpheus's lyre, which bestows the charismatic power of mysterious enchantment, in this case infusing Mars's stratagem actions. Seeing beyond the limitations circumstances may apply to a situation, Mars might utilize personal gifts and nuanced abilities to maneuver beyond restrictions and persevere in his endeavors. Certain people are likely to be celebrated and glorified for their charismatic inventiveness and their mysterious talents and knack, their peculiar skills or abilities to achieve sheerly through constructive focus. They play it like a tune, and it's enchanting to watch. Listen for the sound of music and try to anticipate the melody as it comes around. Later that evening at 8 p.m., Mercury stations direct. The review of personal logic and expression is complete, and our new or freshly edited logic may be engaged. new thinking, new identity language, expressing ourselves anew, fresh personal perspectives, speaking out, voicing our opinions, shouting out our attendance, making our presence known by communicating and talking about ourselves, who we are and what drives us. There's an abundance of mercurial fire here, as it is also Mercury night, making for some very chatty hours chock full of boisterous communication. Arguments and disagreements are likely, but maybe more refreshing and self-assertive than previously, as Mercury has passed through this territory twice already and has had the dross burnt off by the sun. You might find yourself saying things you've been meaning to say for weeks, but augmented by new understandings and crackling clarity. Once again, I would like to welcome back to the show my co-host Bonnie.
Hello.
And today we have Molly Goldstrom, writer, thinker, and visual as well as culinary artist. How you doing, Molly?
Hello. Good. I'm good.
And so you're coming to us from Cornwall, right?
Yes. I'm in Western Cornwall. I'm in a small village called Nanskuk, which is near Redruth. Been here for a couple of weeks. Was digging for some Neolithic flints in a cauliflower field the other day. Didn't really find much, but it's a site that's known for such things to be found.
You almost died?
Yeah, you almost got poisoned?
Yes. Actually, we were walking around this sort of coastal area, the Nor, which is well known for. There's this church in the Nor which has this 400-year-old carved bench with the likeness of a mermaid, and there's this kind of local legend about a sort of a young musical congregant who kind of gets enticed away to sea by a mermaid, and this bench was made in commemoration, so it's kind of there as a relic. So the church is kind of located up on this promontory, and then you can kind of walk along the cliff. And we're walking, there's this sort of chasm, this gush of water kind of flowing down to the sea, and it's very, very lush around there, and the banks just really covered in greenery. And so we came to this area that was like a bank that was covered with, there's this plant that's, I guess, fairly common in Cornwall called gunnera, which, I don't know, I kind of think of it as a prototype for the triffids. It's this really kind of sinister looking plant with giant leaves, and it's almost more sinister when it's dormant. So there are a lot of dormant gunnera plants that kind of, I don't know, just look like these sinister kind of octopus things. And then further downstream, we saw this really enticing plant growing, partly submerged in the water, in these big clumps, that just, I don't know, it was hard to resist picking some. It was just so fresh and green, and it resembled this other plant, Alexander's. The umbellifer family has a number of both highly edible and highly toxic plants.
Which includes carrots, right?
Right. Yes. And lovage. So it goes both ways. But this particular one, I don't know, it seemed very innocuous. It had this kind of nice, fresh, refreshing fragrance, and unthinkingly sort of chomped the stem end in my mouth for a moment, and then didn't really think of it. And later we get home and properly ID the plant, and it turns out that it's something called hemlock water dropwort, which is supposedly the most deadly plant in all of Britain. And I had never heard of it before, and so I was reading, we were reading every imaginable story of, poisonings, some of which, people would have a fatal reaction to touching it or to ingesting the leaves or ingesting the roots, which actually resemble parsnip. So there have been a number of fatalities. So sort of spent the evening wondering if we would experience any symptoms, and luckily not. And I couldn't really tell if the upset stomach was just sort of out of fear and anticipation. But I think from now on I'm going to probably avoid all plants in that family. And I do forage a lot, but I think I'm going to steer clear. And just PSA to anyone out there foraging, just properly identify the plant before you stick it in your mouth.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you're entering a zone that's guarded by a Nereid or something like this,
No. I mean, it seems just in the combination of the sort of almost sentient plants and the sort of mermaid legend.
Yeah, it's too perfect.
I read that that was the plant. I don't know if it was that exact plant, but the hemlock water dropwort was responsible for producing the sardonic grin.
Yes, exactly.
And how people would give it to the elderly people in Sardinia, and when they were intoxicated, they would basically kill them when they were no longer able to take care of themselves.
Wow.
And criminals were also executed that way.
Yeah, it's wild. Yeah, I've definitely almost made that mistake. It's probably a slightly different hemlock, but in the same, in the water, here we would just call it water hemlock, but it has those white flowers, those groups of those kind of constellations of white flowers that it can resemble elderberry to it, from a distance. And as you get close, you're like, oh, wait a minute, that's not elderberry. And there was what we thought we had, an elderberry out back behind our house in a kind of swampy area.
Well, we knew it wasn't because it bloomed a lot earlier
at different times,
than the other elderberry.
But slightly, it was just offset, and I was like, oh, this is maybe it's a different kind of elderberry, and I got closer to check it out, and it was like, oh, wait, no, this is water hemlock, which, I can use that, but for a very different purpose,
Because I guess the water dropwort. I don't think it grows in the U.S. But certainly the regular the water hemlock does. And the flowers do look. I mean, they grow exactly the same way as elderflowers, the kind of umbrella-like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's perfect to have you on this episode as we have Saturn and Capricorn, and this is a great Saturn and Capricorn Mars conjunction story too, with the Saturn and Capricorn being the limits of the laws of nature and that the boundary between two mortality, and then Mars there with that volatility and that violence and the severance of between either side. And then Venus is now in Taurus as well, so Venus in Taurus is the most the fecundity, viriditas, abundance of unfurling greenery and vegetation, and as well as also art, Venus and rulership being art. So it's really awesome having you on, what you're up to. So could you explain what is coming up for you, the project that you're working on right now?
Yes. So right now I'm in the kind of frantic finishing stages of, I've been working on a couple of drawings these last couple of months, which I'm going to be traveling with these drawings to Tromsø, Norway, in exactly a week, actually, for this group exhibition that, I don't know, for me is actually still a little bit shrouded in mystery for me. I was kind of tipped onto it by an old professor of mine, and it's a show that was being curated around the theme of the Svalbard sea vault, and it's I guess it's organized in part by this some sort of mysterious biodiversity nonprofit organization out of Norway, and so this exhibition is being mounted. I'm not really sure even who else is involved, but the nonprofit is flying me there, so I'm going there shortly, and the show actually is going to culminate with basically everything, all the works that were exhibited being conveyed to Svalbard and packed up in the same manner as the seed samples, and then deposited beneath the permafrost in much the same manner. So,
yeah, that's so perfect. You know, with this like I was saying, this Saturn and Capricorn, Saturn being like, and Capricorn sharing so many significations of like the cold, you know, things that are locked away, things that exist for long periods of time, history, and you know, all of these things, and like and then the Venus element, you know, and also Saturn, like security, rationing, the past, the underground, the cold, the contained, and then Venus and Taurus, like art, vegetation, fecundity. It's like such a perfect arrangement for what you're doing right now, you know.
That's kind of an incredible.
Yeah, and they're trying one another by, they'll make a trine, right? Let's see, what day do they make that trine? They make that trine on Saturday, and then next week when you're going there, Venus is trine Mars in Capricorn, which is exalted there. So it's like it's like really perfect. And by trine, it means that they're harmonized. It's like all of these, like the Taurus stuff and the Capricorn stuff are harmonized. So it's so perfect. And you know that they're being put underground, and artwork being put underground into the permafrost. You know, it's one of the more advert examples that you can kind of bring up about how like this aspect would land. Can you explain what the work that you're creating, what that's like? And
so it's a couple of pieces that actually, I mean, it's interesting. I first became interested in seed libraries about a decade ago, and oddly enough, exactly 10 years ago, had been, I don't know, sort of dabbling around making some things that, I don't know, somehow would encapsulate the structure of a seed vault, or just the sort of the tendency throughout history for seed vaults to be kind of violated or disrupted somehow by, you know, human and natural adversities, you know, both, I mean, warfare. I mean, one of the most famous and tragic stories of a seed library was the Vavilov Institute, which came under siege in 1944 in Leningrad, and the scientists ended up being sort of barricaded into this institution, and a number of them ended up perishing while standing guard over collections of edible seeds. Like there was a rice expert that died within reach of, a sack of edible grain.
Wow.
So that story was really fascinating to me. And
yeah, I'll definitely try to find a chart for that event and look at that. That sounds like an interesting investigation.
Yeah, so I don't know. I guess I was trying to at the time think of sort of draw some sort of analogy, like find some sort of analog kind of mathematical structure that would kind of describe like a container that can't contain. I kind of think of the main function of a seed is for it to be dispersed. I mean, they're meant to go out into the world in various ways, and then a seed vault has kind of the opposite function. So I was thinking about hexaflexagons as kind of the perfect little model that would kind of describe this. So a hexaflexagon is basically kind of like a crushed Mobius strip. So it's a hexagon that has a certain number of sets of hidden faces. So it's kind of this model that you can interact with and flip infinitely to reveal hidden faces. So yeah, initially 10 years ago I made a hexaflexagon that was kind of relating to seed libraries. And so actually in part I was revisiting the hexaflexagon, but also at the time that I learned that I was asked to be part of this exhibition, I happened to be reading the Cyrus Garden, or the quincunxial lozenge, which is a kind of strange esoteric text written by Sir Thomas Browne in the mid 17th century. And I happened to be reading it because I noticed that in the work that I make, I kind of keep returning to the sort of lozenge form of quincunx, and then realized there was this whole treatise written about it, and thought, like, oh, I should really see what's been said about it. And then coincidentally, Sir Thomas Browne is largely writing about seeds. I mean, and basically this book is he's kind of trying to find this perfect, neat kind of mathematical figure that art and nature can all be sort of described by, and that is the five-pointed quincunx. So he's kind of finding examples in art and in various natural forms, plants and animals and so forth, that all somehow display the quincunx. And there's this frontispiece, which is a kind of a quincunxial lattice that I discovered actually nearly perfectly corresponds with a flattened hexaflexagon, like the same number of triangular chambers. So it kind of seems perfect also because the treatise is also based on a fictionalized the Garden of Cyrus. So the sort of I guess based in history, based on the historic leader of the within the Fertile Crescent. So that actually also nearly perfectly mapped, corresponded exactly with a set of data. I was searching the database of the Svalbard Seed Vault. You can actually search every single donation that's ever been made, since its opening in 2008. And there's a research institute that was based in Syria, which is kind of the only example of an institution that during a lot of the terrible work there in Syria. There was a need to actually withdraw a bunch of the seeds from Svalbard to copy and then have on reserve in their newly moved seed collection. So actually, there's an almost perfect correspondence between the number of geni that were represented in all of the donations and retractions over the years. This quincunxial lattice and the flattened structure of a hexaflexagon. So I don't know. I've basically been trying to cram as much information into these two drawings as possible, but they'll function as sort of foldable paper models that display this data from Syrian seed donations, and then connecting back to Sir Thomas Browne's invocation of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. So
Amazing.
Yeah, that's so great. It's so perfect that it all kind of comes together and crushes together. And like you said, like if it's foldable, it's like that multi-dimension, which is a quincunxial in nature. And also, I've been really interested for years in the idea of like a chiasmus, which is basically almost the same as like a quincunx, but looked at from a different perspective, like a chiasmus being like meaning from Greek, like to mark with an X or to cross or to make something into an X. They use it in anatomy, like when organs have like a cross structure, or in poetry, like I went to the theater went I, would be a chiasmus, which was they were heavily used by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who is one of the major fans of Sir Thomas Browne, who is really into his writing, and really into the Garden of Cyrus, and the whole title is amazing. The Garden of Cyrus, or the quincunxial lozenge, or network plantations of the ancients, artificially, naturally, and mystically considered. So there's that like projection further, like that it's like, yeah, it can be mathematical, it can be hermetic, it can be like a shape, it can be a way to fold information, it's in our bodies, it's how our bodies are constructed, and it's how like you can do this with poetry, and that there's this whole thing about it that when you make a quincunx or you make a chiasmus, that it's sometimes they occur in nature, but often it's a choice, it's a choice, and in a way it is like the crossroads itself, I think of this show as a chiasmatic show, to taking the art and the magic and the astrology and crossing the subjects, so I feel like it's an often unexplored kind of way of thinking. Borges was really into Sir Thomas Browne as well. I mean, he's kind of just like this, like a seed himself, like he himself, like Walter Benjamin as well, or something. Like he himself is like a seed. His works are like a seed bank.
Yeah. No, it's so perfect that I had no idea that either Borges or Coleridge were fans. Because actually, I mean, this text, I think, received a lot of criticism as well. A lot of people really hated it.
Totally.
But yeah, no, it's actually thinking of both of their work, it's kind of perfect that they would have found inspiration in it as well.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, it's kind of the darker current too, like as Camille Paglia like says, if Wordsworth was the Beach Boys and Byron was the Beatles, then Coleridge would have been the Rolling Stones. It's a little bit darker, and there's more of a maelstrom, like in Coleridge being like the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, or Christabel, kind of like the darker kind of broodier themes. And so like some people in as rationalism came in were like, Sir Thomas Browne, he's crazy, this is bad, but like other people were like, no, this is speaking my language.
Yeah, Yeah, because I mean, he was criticized by so many as being kind of too, I don't know, too fantastical, or it was described as being really terrible prose. Like, I mean, it's really kind of a crazy thing to read. I mean, it's just, he's kind of all over the place, and I don't know, that's what I love about it, but maybe
totally.
Yeah,
which is that like chiasmatic nature, that it is that a quincunx or a chiasmus to be like, yeah, this is, sorry guys, this is like, we're not separating like poetry and analytical thinking here at all, you know, which you find like a lot now in like current occult publishing. You know, it's just, you're going to get both at once. These like people who even they're like heavy scholars, or they even do have PhDs, and they're just not separating. You know, it's like the return of a subjectivity over objectivity. You know, just be like, well, my experience is just going to be in here with the information. Sorry, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of what's fascinating about a lot of, I guess, Enlightenment era or earlier science, or just the notion that music is a branch of science, or all of these things that have become, I don't know, which have been very compartmentalized, maybe now are being reintegrated again. Just different languages being used to maybe describe the same things, or being more closely linked to one another than being thought of as totally separate branches of organizing thought or knowledge.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it seems like people are getting hip to that. This is kind of like funny, more anecdotal, but something I looked over my notes right before we recorded, and I was going to explain, like, on Sunday, you know, on April 1st, April 2nd, when we had Mars applying to Saturn, and I'd written a bunch about how, like, this could be really heavy. It could feel really turbulent or irritating, or you know, just to watch yourself during this time. That's like when you get the malefics coming together in dignity. And then when we actually experienced it, Bonnie and I had gone to a Latin mass that day, like a mass in the extraordinary form, you know, which is like, so like the past and Capricornian.
That one priest was like, "Oh, you mean the mass in Latin?"
Yeah.
He didn't want to say a Latin mass.
Yeah, right. And then
there's a difference.
And then later on that day, we went to my parents' house, and they weren't home; they were away. But the moon was in Scorpio too, so you're getting this kind of over-passioned, kind of dangerous moon. And we're like, oh yeah, all this malefic energy, and then we're like, this could be really bad, but we're just going to go through it and see, you know, of course. And then we ended up just watching old X-Files episodes that were on the cable television, and drinking a lot of red wine, which we hadn't, because we weren't drinking for Lent.
Because Lent was over.
Yeah, Lent was over with that mass, so we started drinking wine and watched the X-Files, which was just such a perfect, you know, which is like that, all that conspiracy and all that tension and that mystery, and and it's a show from the past, so you get all the significations. And that both episodes that we watched were about old people causing murders and disasters and hauntings and stuff, you know. So it was like all the significations of the planets were there, even though they emerged in this way that was basically like pleasant and just like amusing. And then I looked today, and the episode of right before I started the show, and the episode of Rune Soup that just came out is about the X-Files.
No way.
And I was like, that's so weird, because a lot of the other things that the Saturn-Mars conjunction did had to do with cyber attacks. Like 30 years ago, there was a big raid on SJ Games, and I talked about it last week in last week's episode, where the government thought that they were just like a role-playing game company, but that they thought they were all hackers, and they were making like cyberpunk genre role-playing games. And then when we just got that aspect, there was the cyber attacks in Atlanta, and then we watched the X-Files, and then there's this other show about the X-Files that dropped today, and then we're talking to you about quincunxes and chiasmuses and X's, so just a really...
Really, I was thinking about the X-Files a couple of days ago. I was describing my favorite episode to someone. I think actually just a couple of nights ago, the episode that involved these sort of aliens, these kind of gender-shifting, seductive aliens who are disguised as a Mennonite community that makes really nice ceramics.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, that one's really good. Yeah. Wait, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I haven't watched it in a while, but weirdly was describing that episode a few days ago.
Yeah, it's really strange when you're like you see it once. Like for us, it was just an anecdote. We're like, that's funny that it turned into the X-Files, where it could have been like something horrible happened, right? Like you can see the same significations in like the shooting at YouTube, or there's a lot of current events that fit it, like even like let's see what else. I'm looking at a different section. Even like the Google like letter protesting the AI Pentagon like project, and then like even the return of Roseanne as a show, elderly people in a show returning like that. One really overt one is 2 trains hit trucks on train tracks, which is another like X chiasmus like crossing like slam, where one is a truck is stopped and one is just barreling, like it's that Mars Saturn like on a track thing. And then other weird ones, like a family sues a doctor who used his own sperm to impregnate a patient, and that was like back like 25 35 years ago, and then they just realized through one of those ancestry.com tests, that the doctor is the father.
Brutal.
So there's all these things that have come up, but that you get this repeated X-Files thing is really weird. When you see like that happening over and over, relating to an aspect, you're like, oh, that's really interesting, and we're probably not done with it. There's probably going to be more layers where you're like, over the next month or something, you'll be like, oh my god, like X-Files this, X-Files that, or wow, that's like so X-Files-y, like maybe in like a creepy way. We also got, it's interesting about the work you're doing with the seed bank, and the story you were telling about the people protecting the seeds and dying like a foot away from essentially like food source. This is made me think of it, but it's definitely different. Is there's like a Swiss restitution case which returned a John Constable painting to the heir, who rightfully should have owned it, but it's one of those like was raided during it's like Nazi loot, painting, like those like being returned to people finally. Just really interesting that like more of like the stuff coming back from the past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And looking in the art world in general, like sometimes we'll go and look through to see if they fit an aspect, just all the what events are happening as far as art openings. And I just look in like art news, and they're all like 9 things to do in New York City, and they all have a Saturn character to them, which is really interesting.
And then I found one about an exhibit that's opening tomorrow at the New York Historical Society called Feathers, Fashion and the Fight for Wildlife. That is that references the Migratory Bird Treaty Act passed in 1918. And recently the Trump administration has proposed rolling back rules that discourage corporations from harming wildlife, and that basically means that you don't get fined for oil spills anymore, or whatever other horrible things you do. And so this exhibit is in response to that, and I think that that's amazing. That's 1918 and now it's 2018. So it's very important, still an important issue.
Yeah, and
it's amazing though, because it was the crusading environmentalists successfully battled to regulate the fashion industry's craze for plumed accessories, and you're seeing that a lot now with the fashion industry getting called out for behavior that's not ethical, whether it be the way, like the treatment of people or resources, and we're getting to a point where it'd be hard to turn back and it'd be hard to continue the same old behavior, because everybody has a voice and is willing and excited to point it out, to call people out. So I think that can be a positive thing.
Yeah, for sure. And you're seeing that a lot right now with Saturn returning to Capricorn and the end of the Connor crater, like the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, ending this whole 200-year Earth period, and then about to go into a 200-year air period, and that closing out of everything, being like, okay, this is the end of, it's like kind of like it's already climaxed, and it's the part of the movie where they just tie up all the loose ends. You're like, oh, this is what happened with that story, that little subplot, and just tying everything up and being like, okay, these are actually the rules at the how it all ends. You're like, okay, case closed on that, case closed on that, and just
like things that have been open for decades or unresolved for a length of time, finally having some sort of conclusion.
Yeah, the gavel just going down, because it's like Saturn and Capricorn, it can be like the rules of the system, and you'll get that a lot where it's like these are the rules in court, or these are the rules of the government or whatever, but ultimately it's the rules of nature, and at this time where everything is everyone's thinking critically, like, okay, what are the limits, like Saturn boundaries limits, what are the actual limits of nature, and how far have we gone past them? And now we have to, everything is just like it or not, everything's getting reeled back in to the actual limits, and so it's, happening quickly, because we're about to end this whole 200-year period, where it's like, okay, time to transition, let's pull in all these lines,
Yeah.
Well,
in some cases seem premature, things kind of finding, because I can imagine certain things that have kind of simmered over a century or so, versus something that kind of comes to a sweeping, sudden end.
Yeah, I think some things will just end up being on the right time track to be organic, and some things are just going to get yanked,
Yeah.
So we're coming close to a close here. Do you want to talk a little bit about your other projects that you kind of have on a longer scheme? We have just a couple more minutes.
I've been, this has been about a year and a half into this, it's a project, or just sort of a loose umbrella of work having to do with seaweed in one way or another. It's kind of, I guess the way I work a lot of the time is this kind of pursuit of tangents, like all of these different informational tangents that kind of lead me all over the place, and kind of ideally or inevitably maybe alter how I live my life a little bit. And I don't know, it started out kind of as an examination of this writer, Lucy Cavalier, who published several books, I think mostly for younger readers, about algae in the 50s and 60s, and I think pretty much all of her books are out of print now. She wrote about a really strange, diverse range of topics, such as noise pollution, kind of like American high society in the 50s and 60s, cold. Like, she wrote a book about cold and fungus and algae and so forth. And so I was interested in, I don't know, she was kind of this entry point into seaweed and algae, and this was kind of ranged all over the place. Where I was thinking of her as this kind of time traveler, like kind of a fictionalized version of Lucy Cavalier, as a time traveler exploring seaweed in different contexts and different centuries and geographical regions. So I made this cycle of drawings about a year ago, where, I don't know, I was also reading some Samuel Delaney and Alan Gardner, who, I don't know, I was just really fascinated by how time travel affects kind of how one lays out a narrative, and then thinking about this sort of classic John Cheever story called The Swimmer, which is in its way this kind of time travel story involving crossing a town from one swimming pool to the next, and it's this kind of degradation of the central character, and you find out by the end that years have passed as he's traversed all of these swimming pools. But I don't know, so that was the theme of the first leg of work, and I don't know, and then over this past summer I went to the Scottish, the Hebrides, because I was interested in the kelp burning industry there, and then also it's just a place that has a really rich history of seaweed use, seaweed culture.
That leads you to eventually to Kelpius.
Yes, well, actually, oddly enough, Kelpius, he was a figure that I was interested in a few years earlier. And it's funny that his name is Kelpius, but he.
So those are unrelated. That was just like.
Yeah, they're cool. Unrelated. But
we're seriously running out of time here, so we're probably going to have to make this a cliffhanger.
Yeah, but Molly, can you tell our listeners how they can see your work or just keep up with you?
Well, I'm still woefully without a website, but I post work, images of work and life on Instagram under the handle kelp.desk.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and we'll send people your way to find out more, and we'll have you back on the show.